Okay, the title today is Economic Policy Has Reached a Dead End and the Recession Continues. And basically that's the mega issue at this point. We continue with a recession. By the way, there was another major issue, which is the first subtitle, which is reconciling rising unemployment and along with all the chatter about the recession being over. So what we have is this, what's the word, dissonance, cognitive dissonance. On one hand, you hear reports of the recession continuing. On the other hand, you hear reports of how bad it is and will continue. So I'm going to try to sort those two out. And then the other ending up theme of all this is, what can the government do at this point? And just to give you an idea where I'm going with it is we've pretty much reached a dead end, and I'm going to show you why in terms of trying to help the economy. Okay, so let me start off with the first subtitle, Reconciling Rising Unemployment and the Growth Chatter. There was an invention, academic invention, actually it wasn't an academic invention, it was an economic policy invention of the 1960s, the whole concept of something called potential GDP. Potential is, and I'll put that in quotes, and this is potential GDP, which is total, the measure of total production of the economy, and we measure it with dollars of GDP on this axis and over time. And basically, the potential GDP is a calculation made by some econometricians based on the supply capacity of the economy. It's a supply side measure of the capacity of the economy to deliver goods. It's totally based on how much labor. And what they do with labor is they take about 95% of the labor force and they say, okay, that's available, and we know how much output that produces. And then they take the machinery or the capacity of industry, and they take about 80% of capacity. And from that, they derive their measure of how much we can produce if we used 80% of our machine capacity and 95% of our labor. Meaning we will tolerate and shoot for this. This whole thing, by the way, was developed by some policy economists as a guide for how policymakers should come up with a target for economic policy. And the target was to try to reach potential, because the actual spending of the economy could go over it, and since we still really did have labor, but you get into tight labor and wages rise and costs rise and you get into inflation, or if the actual spending goes over potential, then you have very tight capacity utilization, and again, plant and equipment becomes expensive, so products become very expensive. So you ever get into this zone up here, you generate inflation. If you get into this zone where you're below the potential, you create this other problem for the economy, which we have right now, which is unemployment. And actually we have unemployment of both labor as well as plant equipment. So basically potential was a policy guide or a target which would tell the Fed and the government, if we fell below it as we are today, to try to whip up fiscal and monetary policy and all the available means they have to try to steer the economy back to potential. They didn't want to overdo it and overshoot because it would create inflation. So you have problems if you miss on either side, and the policymakers are trying to shoot for the target being potential. And this was a really excellent, let's call it a guide to policy. A rule of thumb, where are we headed? Do we need more fiscal stimulus? Do we need more monetary stimulus, etc.? Now, the usual situation, let's say for the last 25 years or even further back, say the last 50 years, was that we had a lot of variation as we had business cycles in America. Here we go. Since 1946, we've had about 10 or 12 episodes like this, oscillating around potential, and every time trying to steer the actual this is actual GDP spending. In other words, the demand side of the economy. We're trying to steer the demand side of the economy to the supply potential. And they don't want to overdo it because it would create inflation. We've had many of these episodes. And what was true in these episodes is the period of time below the line in a recession was very short. And particularly in the last 25 years, a period of time we called, quote, the Great Moderation. The Great Moderation was a period, I guess started the middle 1980s or so, that we had really just two episodes of kind of approaching potential on the downside, and they managed to get it back up. And so we really didn't, over the last 25 years, this is up to 2007, that is, we really only had two episodes where we got below the line, so to speak, and that's extremely important because we're going to talk about financial market reaction to all this very shortly. And the financial market reaction to the current economic situation is so much based on what they observed over the last 25 years. Basically, the education of those on Wall Street is very much based on what they learned since they've been in the market. And an awful lot of them have been in the market when we had few of these episodes on the downside. And by the way, they were quickly reversed, very, very quickly. The amount of time spent below the line would be like 11 months. That's the average for the whole post-war period. In the last 25 years, the amount of time we missed on the low side would be less than 6 months. So economic recessions were easily turned around by the Fed applying easy monetary policy. It was rare and unusual when we'd use fiscal policy to turn the economy around. We did it under George Bush, and that was unusual. In the timing, he was just elected president. We go into the tech bust. They actually convened a meeting here in Austin at the downtown at the Stephen F. Austin, I believe, and they drummed up support in December, the year he was elected. I guess that's what 2000. And by the time he came in office, they had a consensus feeling that we were below the line, we're heading below the line, and first order of business on taking office was to have a tax cut, which we're now on the edge of possibly reversing next year. So basically, we used fiscal policy to get back up. We used monetary policy to get back up. We didn't spend much time down there, and it's been a long time since we've been severely below the line. The last time would be really actually it would be the recession of the early 1980s, which was intended to take out the high inflation rate of the 70s. So that's the last time we spent a significant amount of time below the line, so to speak. So this background and this framework and this analysis is a wonderful tool to explain today the inconsistency. And the inconsistency is that of so many people talking about the depth of the recession, how difficult it is, how prolonged it might be. At the same time, you have another group of people talking about and have declared the recession over months ago. Of course, I can't remember the month that Kramer time dated the end of the recession. It must have been sometime last spring. So there's a lot cognitive dissonance. I mean, where are we? Are we in a recession, or have we recovered? Well, basically, the situation that exists today is that we were in a large economic boom from 2003 to 2007. What turned it down, I discussed last summer, and those of you interested, you might pick up on some of the back tapes on Spellman.com. And we crashed below it pretty far, and we've been going this way. We went actually sideways for a while, and now there's some small suggestion that we're beginning to grow again. The size of the gap is about 7% loss of output. We went from 15 trillion to 14 trillion, which is about 7%. We are now approaching 2 years that we've been below the line, which is way longer than we've ever been before. And indeed, we now have had a bottom, and we now have a suggestion that we're going to start to have some growth. And growth, if you think about levels and growth, this is the level of potential GDP we're shooting for. This is the level of actual spending, but the growth rate is the tangent to the curve. And so what you see is when you're going down we're in negative growth. You hit the bottom, growth goes to zero. You turn the corner, now we have positive growth. And guess what? Growth gets faster as you're climbing back up. So you go from the sequence of zero growth to maybe 1% growth to 2% growth. But when you're on the path to recovery, you could have several years, like 2 or 3 or 4 years, of growing at the rate of 5-6% to reattain potential, and then shoot through it again. So what we then had in the past is turning the corner, and what the market got very excited about, and what a lot of people like Kramer, who are trying to say it's all over, is they saw that that we attained the bottom and then turned around and had some positive growth, like 0.03, 3%, something like that. And they anticipate, just as before, we're going to close that gap quickly. Now so basically we have two groups out there. Some people see the margin of the 7%, and others see the fact that we've turned the corner with the anticipation, just like in the good old days, we will go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 5% growth, and we're back and healed. So that hopefully explains it too. Now, so basically you have two forecasts out there, two groups, and one group is looking at at the level, the discrepancy in the level. The other one is looking at the growth. Well, it's relatively easy to grow from a low ebb. And the question then is, which path to recovery are we going to follow?